Cloud. Okay.
Being recorded.
Okay, shows up on your screen. We are being recorded. So good morning or afternoon or whenever it is that you're watching to those who are watching the recording. And good morning to those of us who are here. We will not be meeting the week before Passover. So that means we'll meet next week, which is the 24th. Let me just look at my calendar. Yes,
Not
we'll
the
meet
third, not the
next.
31st.
We will not meet the 31st, right?
Right.
Passover begins, wow, April 1st,
Yep.
which in the, the confusing way we talk about things is early for relatively early for Passover. Uh,
Rabbi, your sound is gone from my computer.
you can't hear me? Uh-oh, let me just fill
Yeah,
We hear you
my
fine.
microphone a little bit here. How's that? Can you all hear me?
We can hear I could you. Hear you.
Rini, can you hear me? Re
I'm not getting any sound.
Okay, why don't you go get off and come back and see
Oh,
if
there
that
it is.
oh, you got it?
I
Okay.
got it. Uh-huh.
Okay. So we'll meet next week, the 24th, but we will not meet on the 31st. It's the day before Pesach, and I suspect, like many of you, I will be very busy getting things together for the holiday. Already started. I'm sure many of you have as well. We did our major shopping at the shop right on Route 4, which I think has a great selection of Passover items. More and more every year.
And our ShopRite has fewer and fewer every year.
I've heard that from some other people I know around the country that some places are not as well stocked as they may have been in the past. But in this part of the world, you know,
we just shopped this morning at Paramus, and it was like every shelf was packed.
yeah, that's where we were. Yeah, the shop
They,
right?
Job
we
right.
had,
Yeah, on Route 4. Yeah, that they have
yeah.
And there's,
multiple brands of anything you could want.
and
No, really terrible. The only good part is that I cook mostly fresh vegetables and salads and stuff like that. So I don't need most of those things, but it was pretty sparse.
Yeah,
So
well, that's good for
well,
you. And
one of the things they said at the shop right is the shelves have been going fast because they feel that a lot of people are not going to Israel this year.
ah,
interesting. Yeah.
that's true. That I'll bet that. Yeah, yeah. That probably has an effect in this in our neck of the woods. Interesting. Okay, so let's go back. We were talking about burial of non-Jews in Jewish cemeteries.
Rabbi,
And
can you make the print larger?
yes, I think I can do that. Let's try that. How's that?
A little better, but okay. At least for me,
I
it's not great.
I can't. Let me do.
That was better.
Okay, how's this?
Not as good as you had it a few minutes ago, a few
Okay,
seconds.
that's about as big as I can get it.
All right, I guess that'll do. It's just
Jerry, did you make it bigger on your screen?
I don't know, can I?
Yeah, if you
Yes, I
go
can, but
view options, and then go to 100%.
yeah,
Double click it and you'll get it bigger.
Yeah, be sure you're on full screen.
yeah, I am. Well, I'm not a full. I'm okay.
Okay. All right. So we looked at some of the historical materials, and from the historical materials, we saw that yes, it does talk in the Bible about Abraham buying a plot for his family, and Joseph in Egypt wanting to be buried in the family plot, and there probably were family plots where people were buried, and those family plots at some point, we're not quite sure when, became communal cemeteries, and then there are certain texts that we saw about who can be buried where. And the question that we're looking at in this teshuva is from the Rabbinical Assembly Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And it was approved by a vote of 10 in favor, 1 against, and 3 abstaining, which means that it really has had the major acceptance. We don't know if those 4 who voted against or abstained thought it was too restrictive or not liberal enough. We're not sure how they felt about that, but at least we know that what the conclusions are going to be here are going to be the conclusions that would be considered to be mainline, shall we say, in the conservative movement. Okay, and the specific question they're being asked here is about a non-Jewish spouse, children of an interfaith marriage who may not have been formally converted or were patriarchal and not matriarchal Jews, so by the rules of our movement officially weren't Jewish. And then they also ask, what kind of ceremony should it be and who should officiate at the ceremony? Right? If there's a non-Jew being buried, if that is acceptable at the cemetery, well, who officiates and what's acceptable? Okay, so that was the question. So and we did go through part of this, so I'm going to go through the first 5 pages a little quickly, and then we'll pick up from there. But we probably doesn't hurt to refresh our memory as to where we were when we finished last time. So they said the development of Jewish communal cemeteries is obscure, developed at some point from family plots. Communal ceremonies may have started in Babylonia. The land was flat and there were few caves. We know that people were buried in caves, and we have a lot of caves in Israel today. If you go on a trip to Israel and you tour the whole country, you're certain to see caves where people were buried in the biblical and Talmudic periods. Okay. And at one point, it said the rabbis put a holy obligation on the children of Israel to have special graveyards. And we know that became a general rule that when a new Jewish community was established somewhere, one of the first things they did was buy land for a cemetery. And usually the synagogue owned and the synagogue controlled that cemetery. As I pointed out, in Manhattan, there's the oldest Jewish cemetery in North America, which is in Chinatown, which at that time was well north of where the city, Wall Street probably was the northern border of the Dutch settlement. And then way north of that, you had what is today Chinatown, where the cemetery existed. Okay. Now, we had this text. We support the indigent of the non-Jews with the indigent of the Jews. We visit the sick of the non-Jews with the sick of the Jews. And here's the classic question, which exists at the time of the Talmud. We bury the dead of the non-Jews with the dead of the Jews because of the ways of peace. Now, as we will see, what that means exactly, it certainly does seem to indicate that there were places where Jews and non-Jews were buried together. But later scholars, as we'll see this morning, interpreted that very narrowly, or some more broadly. I mean, does it mean any cemetery? You can have a mixed cemetery, or is it restricted to certain types of circumstances, right? And Rashi, who lives in the Middle Ages, not in Jewish graves, rather we involve ourselves in the burial when they are found killed with Israel, i.e., if you find let's say there was a battlefield or some other natural disaster, a flood, and there are victims of Jews and non-Jews in a large area, well, we work with the Jews together and the non-Jews for those victims. But does that mean there's a general rule? See, Rashi is being very restrictive. We involved ourselves with their burial when they are found killed with, right? Harugim im Yisrael, with Jews, as opposed to, so he's added something, right? Which is not in the Talmudic statement, but he's expressing what he sees to be the appropriate pattern of observance of his time. Okay. And why does Rashi say that? Because Lefisha ein kovrim rasha etzel tzaddik. We shouldn't bury a righteous person next to someone who is wicked. But what does it say about non-Jews, by the way? right? Is not the hidden assumption here that we're doing this because we're defining non-Jews as Rasha, right? Speaking of Passover, right? Where does the word Rasha appear in the Haggadah? You think about the evil son, right? But we are assuming, and that's a topic we're going to be dealing with actually in a couple of weeks. What is the view of the Jewish community about non-Jews? Are they all evil people? Are they different? Are certain non-Jews different from other non-Jews? How does that? This clearly assumes something about non-Jews at that time, which we may not agree with today. So what does that mean? We'll take a look at that in a few weeks. Okay. All right. And here is a commentary that leaves out the words "with the dead of the Jews." Right? It says, "Bury the dead of the idol worshippers, of the Kohavim," literally people who worship actually stars or other such things, "for the sake of peace." But it doesn't say "with the dead of the Jews." So this commentary obviously is reflecting what Rashi had just said, that there's a time when we don't do that. Okay, so how do we understand Rashi? Right? Some say we do not bury them in Jewish cemeteries, but we involve ourselves with their burial. Okay, so we pick up the bodies, we help them move the bodies from where they died to where they're going to be buried, but the place that they're going to be buried is not in the Jewish area. Okay. But there is one classical commentator who seems to permit the burial of Jews and non-Jews together. So we have some differences of opinion. This one says, just as we support the non-Jewish poor together with the Jewish poor, we can bury the non-Jewish dead together with the Jewish dead. And the Bach, another commentary, goes further. And if we find their dead killed with Israel, now notice what he's saying. It was a flood, it was a fire, it was something happened that caused a whole bunch of people to die, and they were Jews and non-Jews. But even here, he's the im mitzaum harugim im Yisrael. They were with Israel. We can bury their dead in the graves of the Israel, even though the Ron said it's clear we don't bury non-Jews next to the Jew, for we don't bury a wicked Jew next to a righteous one, or even more so, we don't bury a non-Jew next to a Jew. However, the Bach continues, we can bury the non-Jewish dead with the Jewish dead in the same courtyard for the sake of peace. Now, when he says courtyard, he probably means cemetery. Okay. So the majority of these medieval commentaries don't allow it. There seems to be one who does. So let's take a look at the conservative movements. Okay. Now we're moving into a new area. In the past, there were questions that were answered. Okay. These are going to refer to Rabbi Ben Zion Bergman, a matter of grave concern, a question of mixed burial, and Rabbi Myron Geller, peaceful paths, burial of non-Jews in Jewish cemetery following a common disaster. These are teshuvot. They were written a number of years ago. Okay. So here's Rabbi Geller. Rashi and others limit the application of a common disaster to a common disaster where non-Jews and Jews are found among the dead of each other. So there's a very restrictive reading of that Talmudic passage. The identification of the faith group of each of the cadavers is possible, and the rabbis are concerned about the unseemliness of Jews carrying away their own dead for burial while abandoning the non-Jewish dead. Imagine, there's a flood. So you have in that community, the Jewish, the Chevra Kadisha, which was the group that took care of the dead, would go to where the flood was and says, okay, let's find the non-Jews, and we'll just leave them there. The Jews will take and bury, but the non-Jews are not going to do anything about. Okay. That's because of the ways of peace. Does Rashi acknowledge a Jewish obligation to non-Jewish dead? It is restricted to burial alone, but internment in a Jewish cemetery is not permitted. However, if the non-Jewish dead are found without Jewish dead, no obligation. So that's a very restrictive one. Okay. However, this other teshuvah, what happens when body parts and limbs of Jews and Gentiles are so mangled they cannot be identified? May these limbs and body parts from Jews and non-Jews be buried in a mass grave? Rabbi Geller concludes, the burial of Jews and non-Jews or their body parts or limbs found together with a common disaster is permitted in a Jewish cemetery. Okay. So we have some differences of opinions, whether the burial of non-Jews, we know that the Reform movement allows non-Jewish spouses, but Rabbi, I'm sorry, I have to go back. While a congregation may seek to have its own section in the cemetery, let's assume he's talking about a situation where in a community, there's one large Jewish cemetery, and the Reform synagogue gets part of it, the conservative synagogue gets part of it, and the Orthodox synagogue gets part of it. When a congregation may, for a variety of reasons, seek to have its own section of the cemetery, we need not establish a barrier separating the section from the rest of the Jewish cemetery. The interment of non-Jewish spouses and children by Reform rabbis does not vitiate the Jewish character of the cemetery. So imagine there's one cemetery in town. In the Reform part, they bury non-Jewish spouses. Does that mean that the conservative part has to be clearly delineated and separated in some way from that Reform part, because the Reform part's allowing non-Jews to be buried there? Or does that mean that cemetery, that whole cemetery, is no longer valid for Jewish burials? Okay. He is saying the interment of non-Jewish spouses does not vitiate the Jewish character of the cemetery, i.e., if one part over there has non-Jewish spouses, your part is still okay. Okay. And Rabbi Golinkin, we looked at what he said, and he says there should be a section there should be a separation, a wall, bushes, or a path or a road. And that, by the way, that's written for Israel. Okay. Okay. So first they're going to start saying, yeah, there are places that allow it, but at least there's a separation of some sort. Okay. A discussion of the burial of non-Jews in Jewish cemeteries is part of a large discussion of how Judaism views non-Jews. Okay. The Bible classified people as Israelite or non-Israelite. The assumption is that the non-Jews were idolaters, but there is a category in the Talmudic period, late biblical, early Talmudic period, Yirei Shemayim, God-fearers, who seems to have been members of the Gentile community who affiliated themselves to some degree with Jewish morality and monotheism, yet are not in obedience to all aspects of Jewish law. What about those people? Could they be buried? How do we feel about them? We'll get into more detail later on. In the Middle Ages, that the economic reality, the economic circumstances allows us to change halakhic prohibitions with non-Jews. What about Christians, which the Talmud wasn't really dealing with very much? They're not idolaters. How do we deal with them? Okay. Jewish tradition and halakha have periodically revisited the status of non-Jews for social and economic reasons, permitted what was once prohibited. Trading with them, for example. Halakha differentiates between non-Jews who are monotheistic and those who are not. And this division has been accepted by the Reform movement. Okay, so now we have non-Jews who aren't idolaters. Could they be buried? So a more liberal sense is an Orthodox view. It appears that the non-halakhic convert, i.e., people who we converted or the Reform movement converted, and the incomplete convert, they died before they finished everything, but they died before they went to the mikvah. I had a case like that. While cannot clearly be labeled Jewish, some form of identification enables them to qualify for some sort of limited burial privileges in a Jewish cemetery. That's a fairly liberal Orthodox view. That these non-Jews, through their identification with Jewish community, have attained Shem Yisrael, being part of the community, without having acquired the higher level of the holiness of Israel. We are suggesting that in our times and in the spirit of Josephus, we want to acknowledge those non-Jews married to Jews to permit their burial in a separate section of a Jewish cemetery. What do you think of that? Good decision, bad decision? Would you support it? Anyone? If your synagogue said that they were going to do this, how would you react? Yeah, Rini?
Well, I'm having a little trouble with this whole thing because um, I hadn't really thought about it before. I know there are Jewish cemeteries and non-Jewish cemeteries, but as times change, I know quite a few people who are married to non-Jewish spouses who haven't converted. Even a lot of men who have raised Jewish children, even though they're not Jew, they never converted, but the children were Jewish by virtue of their mother supported them through bar mitzvahs and all that stuff. And people are people. I don't see why they can't be buried with their family. I don't understand. I'm having trouble understanding the difference unless there's a big cross on the grave.
Okay.
If it's just a grave, it's a person, and I so that's
So
that's
you would support what we just read.
yeah.
Well, in other words, the writers of this teshuva are saying, things are different from ancient times. And even in ancient times, there was some allowance for the burial of Jews and non-Jews together, very limited, and some rabbis made it very extremely limited. But nowadays, there are some people who should be buried in our cemeteries. Okay. Anyone else? How do you feel? They think good decision or a bad decision? Charlie, what do you think?
Well, I think that the justification, that is the emergency condition where you have to, there was a disaster or an earthquake or something, and you're burying the dead with the non-dead. I mean, you're burying the Jew with the non-Jew because of the emergency. That would not be a rationale for doing burial of a Jew and a non-Jew today when there's a non-emergency. So, I mean, to use an emergency condition as a justification, I think, is not good reasoning.
Okay. What about the justification that the non-Jew today is not the type of idol worshiper or the Rasha or the evil
Well, to
person?
me, the separation, I would concur with a separation. They can be buried in a cemetery, but in maybe a different area or apart from the. I mean, I don't know how many are comfortable with the fact that they could be buried next to a non-Jew. I
Mhm.
mean, any of us in any cemetery, is that what we're advocating?
No, they are advocating the
No, I mean,
burial
we a
in a
person, our burial plot could be next to a plot that is a non-Jew.
in what they are recommending here is a separate section.
Oh, okay.
This is
Well,
the section where only Jews. This is a separate section with Jews and some non-Jews who had a close relationship in some way with the Jew, i.e., a spouse or a child who was a patriarchal a child and not officially a Jew. So they're saying one section, everybody's Jewish, another section, that's not the case. Would you be okay with
I
that,
would say
Charlie?
some separation in the same cemetery. I would have no objection to being in the same cemetery, but my comfort level would be that they are somewhat separated and together, the families together, but separated from the other graves.
The all Jewish section.
Yes.
Aren't soldiers mixed? Burial of soldiers is mixed.
Well, we do have military cemeteries, as
Right.
just pointed out. And as I'm sure many of you know, many of these military cemeteries, starting actually, all right, well, military cemeteries started after the Civil War. And if you go to a Civil War cemetery, all you see are little stones over the graves. But we have in our heads what started in with the wars in Europe, with the rows and rows of crosses, and then actually initially everybody got buried under a cross. But that at one point, I don't remember exactly when, the Jewish community said no, we should bury the Jewish soldiers who died under a Magen David. And that is the case in many military cemeteries, correct?
Right.
That's
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think the chaplain, Jews becoming chaplains was Civil War era, I believe. So anything prior to the Civil War, the Jews who died in battle may have died with a cross.
No, well, no. They didn't have that. And what I'm pointing out is that the concept and the reality of having a military cemetery is a Civil War. Prior to the Civil War, they didn't have military cemeteries. They started having military cemeteries somewhat after the Civil War, and those cemeteries, everyone's buried together usually without any religious. It's not the big crosses in the Magen David. It's a little stone on the ground. That's what they look like. It's only in the wars in Europe that you started having the military cemeteries with the crosses, and then later on, the Jewish community said no, we need to have a Magen David. So yes, that's an example of people. And the military cemeteries today, I've done funerals for veterans who were buried in a military cemetery. So they're definitely having Jews and non-Jews buried together, and it's not a common disaster. It's they were veterans of World War II, let's say, and they died 10 years ago. So that is a reality that we have. This is talking about something else, right? This is talking about spouses, children. So what they're suggesting is a separate area, separated. I said, we've had two people think that that's okay. Anyone else?
I'm wondering how a Christian would feel about being buried next to a Jewish person. We're all objecting to being buried next to a Christian person, but how do you know they want to be buried next to Jewish people? I mean,
well, wait, they want to be buried next to their spouse.
no, I don't mean a spouse. I mean in general.
We're not talking in general, okay?
No, I know, but I'm saying.
Oh, I see. In terms of the military
In terms of
cemeteries?
anything, we're talking about people who have died. They don't have opinions anymore, and they're just bodies. I never thought about this before. I've always thought, Jewish cemetery, fine. But I started thinking about it when you brought it up, but even a little before, because Ted and I have burial plots in a Jewish cemetery in North Jersey. And now we belong to the Princeton Jewish Center. We wanted to be buried in their Jewish cemetery, which is a small part of a Christian cemetery in Princeton. There's this cemetery with people who've been buried for 300 years or whatever. And it's a very small space, and it is full. And some of the members of the congregation are just taking spots nearby. But, so the whole issue to me suddenly has a different ring. I mean, we haven't done that, but, if it comes from righteous Jews and non-righteous Jews, I'd rather be buried next to a righteous Christian than a wicked Jew. So, but I don't have it, once I'm in the ground, what difference does it make? Is what I'm getting to.
Okay, so you could argue what you're in the ground, what difference does it make? But the point you're making that yes, that's not an uncommon situation. Atlanta is a huge example of that. I think I mentioned that there's a wonderful. Okay, I like cemeteries. Sorry, it's a wonderful, huge cemetery dating from before the Civil War in Atlanta, which I recommend. It's a great little tour you can do. And you can see remnants of bullets that were shot during the Civil War on the cemetery grounds. And there's a Jewish section separate from the Christian section, but there's a Jewish section. That's sort of what happened, what you're telling me in Princeton. But as you point out, those are usually smaller areas and they get filled up pretty quickly. So what do you do now? Is it you want to be buried together, but do you want to be buried near where you lived, right? Or do you want to go to a Jewish cemetery? Which one is it? Bethel Cedar Park?
I don't know.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know. I think it was part of maybe Paramus Jewish Center.
Okay, we're
My
talking about
brother,
that.
my
Yeah,
brother.
yeah. It's do you want to be buried up here in a huge, and I say this, huge
Yes.
Jewish cemetery? So that's that may be a personal question, but what they're suggesting here is yes, we can bury non-Jewish spouses and children in a Jewish cemetery, but in a separate section. That's what they're saying. Okay, as opposed to the Reform movement, who does not say we need a separate section.
Well, I don't agree with the reform movement on a lot of things, but in that thing, I think I might.
Okay.
In
Any
that
other
aspect.
comment? Any other comment? No? Okay. We'll move on. Two other modern phenomenon cause us to suggest we might continue to open our communities to those non-Jews who have tied their lives to Jews and to the Jewish community. Now, so you know what they're going to show. Interfaith families, right? There's a large number of intermarriages. You remember that David Golinkin Teshuvah, they pointed that out and they said something, they're in Israel. So they said, oh, well, maybe in the future there won't be any interfaith marriage as well. I thought that was totally unrealistic. Every rabbi has members who are married to non-Jews, who knows non-Jews have strong connection to the Jewish community, while deciding for various reasons not to formally affiliate with Judaism through conversions. These non-Jews are part of our community, right? We have shown above that there is no specific halakhic prohibition to bury a non-Jew in a Jewish cemetery. They're basing themselves on those Talmudic texts, okay? Halacha has relooked at the relationship between Jews and non-Jews. Well, what are the issues? What about the cemeteries themselves? We're talking about, well, we'd like to do this, but what about the cemeteries themselves? Remember, cemeteries are organizations that have their own rules. Again, some of them are business operations like Bethel Cedar Park. It's purely commercial, privately owned burial ground versus synagogues that own cemeteries, right? The two largest Jewish cemetery holding companies in Eastern Massachusetts both make it clear that the person is buying the right to be buried in the cemetery. The person is not buying the actual grave. So the person who bought the grave can't say to the cemetery, I want to bury whoever I want to bury in this grave because I own it. In that case, the cemetery says, no, you don't own the grave. You own the right to bury someone in this grave based upon agreement to our rules and regulations. Okay? Their rules stipulate that only persons of the Jewish faith may be buried in the cemetery, although both associations have separate sections within the cemetery where non-Jewish and Jewish family members may be buried next to each other. Okay, so there are these commercial cemeteries. And by the way, I believe that is true for some of the larger Jewish commercial cemeteries in this part of the world. There was a discussion among our colleagues recently. One of our colleagues had a case and he was asking about this, and I believe there are several cemeteries in this area that do have separate sections. But the main part of the cemetery, as is indicated here and that one in New England, only allows the burials of Jews. Okay, so let's go on a separate section, right? Other Jews may also be buried in this section, provided they are informed that when they acquire the burial plots, that non-Jewish spouses will be also buried in this section. In other words, here's the separate section, and if you want to plot in that section, anybody, any Jew can also be buried there. But if you are buried there, recognize you will be buried and maybe next to a non-Jewish spouse. Okay. A section for mixed burials, right? The separation of the two sections can be by a wall, a bush, or a path. If possible, a path is preferable. A physical barrier sends a message of exclusion. However, a path or road or sidewalk of 2.3 meters. What's that? 2.3 meters, 7 feet approximately. I'm doing this in my head. Which is easily crossed, sends a message that the non-Jewish spouse was part of the present-day Jewish extended community. Okay, so you have a road as opposed to, say, a bush. What about the funeral? Who does the funeral? The funerals of the non-Jewish spouses are sensitive. The funeral at the funeral at the funeral home and at the Jewish cemetery, assuming, or in some cases, should not contain non-Jewish ritual. The ceremony should include psalms, a eulogy, and appropriate prayers. Jewish relatives, look what I think, may elect to say a Kaddish. They can't say that you're obligated because the person who's being buried is a non-Jew. But they're saying there's no prohibition in saying Kaddish for someone who is not Jewish in memory of the deceased. They may elect to say Kaddish for 30 days, which is what you say for a non-spouse, sibling or a child, or 11 or 12 months is what you say for a parent as appropriate. Here's that question that was raised. The tombstone should not have any non-Jewish religious symbols engraved on it.
I agree with that.
No big cross, right?
Right.
There were some Russian Jews in Nashville, and no one asked me, of course. And one of them was very proud of his service in the Red Army, Soviet Army. So there is a gravestone in Nashville in the Western Synagogue Cemetery with a big engraving of a tank, clearly a Russian tank, engraved on it. Hey, what can I say? He was very proud of his military service. Like I said, they didn't ask me about it. They just put it up. Okay, but no crosses, right? No crosses or other non-Jewish. Okay, here's the summary. There is no specific prohibition in the entire Bible dealing with buried non-Jews together with Jews, right? Think about it in the Bible. Well, of course, the Bible assumes that there are family plots for Jews. Jewish graves in biblical times were privately owned caves or tombs reserved for family members, those mention of the graves of the common people. This continued to be the practice in Talmudic time. The history of the development of Jewish communal cemeteries is obscure, but around the 19th century, they became part of the general community cemeteries for all religions and standards. Okay, so in other words, at some point, as you had in Princeton, as they have in Atlanta, and my guess is in many other towns, that this, the town zones, this is the part of town for cemeteries. And there's one big cemetery for everybody. We'll divide it up by religion, but this is it. And that is not an uncommon nor an unreasonable way of where things can be. Again, when you live in the New York, New Jersey area, you just make the assumptions that things are the way they are here. That's the way they are everywhere else, but that is not the case with cemeteries. Okay, the Talmud has one statement that deals with the burial of non-Jews together with Jews because of the ways of peace. Standing by this itself, the statement at the very least permits Jews to be involved in the burials of non-Jewish. It might, see, notice how careful they're being here. It might also mean that it is permitted to bury non-Jews together with Jews, right? We've had different readings of that. Rashi's interpretation of the statement provides a very different understanding. He says, not in the graves of Jews, but one cares for them as if they were found together with Jewish bodies. Rashi's interpretation that non-Jews were not to be buried in Jewish cemeteries may reflect earlier practice, but certainly became the accepted practice, right? There was that issue of Rasha, the evil people not being buried near righteous people. Other commentaries expand Rashi's understanding of the Talmudic passage to include the burial of non-Jews, even if no Jewish dead were found with them. Restricted. Finally, one commentary, the Bach, returns to the original Talmudic statement and permits the burial of non-Jews together with Jews in the same courtyard. If you travel through Europe, you'll know that there's a Jewish cemetery in most towns that had, Jewish Jews. Unfortunately, tragically, because of the Holocaust, many of those Jewish cemeteries were destroyed. But some of them, including the one in the town of Patzov, where our Holocaust Memorial Torah is from, are being the central government maintained it, and so that's I've been in that cemetery, and it's actually very nicely maintained. But it is also on the outskirts of the town, established in the I think 17th century as Jews moved into that small town. Rabbi Myron Gellin, at a teshuva called Peaceful Paths, approved by the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, shows one way the Bach could be interpreted. The burial of Jews and non-Jews, or parts or limbs found together following a common disaster, is permitted. Again, restrictive. Such burial does not desecrate the final place of Jews already interred there and does not prohibit future Jewish burials. In this other teshuva by Rabbi Ben Zion Bergman, the burial of a non-Jew in the Reform section of a Jewish communal cemetery detracts from the sanctity of the rest of the cemetery. He says the interment of non-Jewish spouses and children by Reform rabbis does not vitiate the Jewish character. Okay, so that's in an area, in a town perhaps, that has one Jewish cemetery area, and the different denominations have different parts in it. So the fact that there are non-Jews in the Reform part does not mean that the whole cemetery is no longer a Jewish cemetery. Okay. 1,000-year-old custom should be respected and not lightly discarded, that there are separate cemeteries just for Jews. Nevertheless, we live in different times. Our relations to non-Jews are very different. Many of us have non-Jews in our family. All of us know non-Jews who are strongly connected to the Jewish community. There's interfaith marriage, the feelings that make people welcome, non-Jewish spouses and children who are involved in our synagogues, while non-Jewish are nevertheless part of our community. Our tradition has continually evolved in our understanding and differentiation of non-Jews. We respect those who have married Jews and have raised Jewish families and are connected to the Jewish communities. Since there is no specific prohibition in the Bible or the Talmud, and the first mention of a prohibition is Rashi. Now, Rashi, remember, is 500 years after the Talmud has been edited and finalized, 500 or 600 years. Special provisions should be made to allow the non-Jewish spouses to be buried in the Jewish cemeteries, specially designated area. So here's the final conclusion. We recommend the creation of a mixed burial section in Jewish cemeteries where non-Jewish spouses and children may be buried alongside Jews. The mixed section should be separated from the rest of the cemetery by a path, a road, or a sidewalk of 4 amot, 2.3 meters, 7 feet. Following, it is permitted for rabbis to attend and officiate at the funerals of non-Jewish spouses and children. Conducted by Jewish clergy for the funeral, not containing any non-Jewish ritual. I've often been asked, do we allow for the Masons? That's a fraternal group. They have rituals for burials, which are sort of non-denominational. Not to mention we have military parts of funerals, which we also allow. The ceremony might include Psalm 23, eulogy, appropriate prayers. surviving Jewish families, they can say the Kaddish, the tombstone should have a non-Jew. Okay, so there's their conclusion. What do you say about the conclusion? Good conclusion? Bad conclusion? Rini?
Well, you know what I said before about it wouldn't bother me being buried next to someone who wasn't Jewish. On the other hand, the the number one on their conclusion is to be sensitive to commitments that were made to those who have already been buried who might not be comfortable. So in that respect, I could see having a separate section. My initial reaction was it's disrespectful to the Jewish person and their supportive non-Jewish spouse, but I recognize that there are people who would really be uncomfortable and have been already buried there or would still be uncomfortable. So I think it's a good conclusion.
Okay. Anyone else? Would you be comfortable if you're, well, see, we don't have a situation at our synagogue because we're our I think there are 3 or 4 areas in Bethel Cedar Park between all the mergers that our synagogue has gone through over the years. There are at least 3, I think there may be 4, maybe even 5 areas in Bethel Cedar Park that we own. I'll take that back. In which we own the right to have our members buried there, right? So I suspect many of you are familiar with those different areas. Those are areas only for Jews. I believe, and I haven't double checked this, that Bethel Cedar Park does have a mixed area. Well, I certainly know that Bethel Cedar Park has a non-Jewish area. Right? Any of you who have exited the cemetery onto what's it called? Old Soldiers Road. Is that the name of the street on the side of the cemetery? Whatever that is. Not on Forest Avenue, but on the street that intersects.
That's correct.
Old Soldiers Road, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. There is a non-Jewish area there that's a mausoleum, very large, above ground burials. And by the way, they have 2 very large areas for Jews to be buried above ground, which is, by the way, not the tradition. But it's some people prefer it, and it's a private company, and they make a nice profit. And I would certainly discourage above ground burial, but people seem to want to do that. Okay, so we're comfortable with this. Would you be comfortable if you had a cemetery that had Jews and non-Jews together in it, and someone said, well, you want to be buried in our cemetery? The only section where we have openings is the non-Jewish and the mixed section. Would you be comfortable being buried there?
Mm-hmm. Would.
Anyone else?
Somehow I'll be comfortable no matter what.
No, I would not.
Somehow I won't even know.
Yeah.
I would not.
Yes, I would be comfortable.
Who said?
I would not.
Yeah, you would not. Okay, fair enough. But does this solution sound reasonable?
To me, yes, it does.
You can live with that. In other words, knowing that there's another section which maybe I'm not going to be comfortable being buried there. It's a good solution to a very real issue that we see. As a matter of fact, I know of people who have, when they decide to join a synagogue, even if they're fairly young, they want to know, what are the rules about your cemetery? I'm not going to join your synagogue if I can't be buried in your cemetery next to my spouse.
Rabbi, when are you going to start the next subject?
We may start it in 2 minutes.
By the way, my daughter Sharon is on. She wants to listen to the next subject.
Oh, about the yoga and the transcendental meditation.
Yeah,
we have 8 minutes. Why don't I do this first? Any questions about this topic? Let's say that to begin with. Okay. I'm just going to say a few words. I'll probably repeat it next time. Okay, so if you miss what I'm doing right now, not a big deal. Because what I'm going to do is I got to open it up. Sorry. I want to touch on one thing, which I will review next time we do this. I just need to say a little bit. I'll do a few words of introduction to our new subject. Only I have to get the right. Sorry, I didn't open. I didn't know how far we would get today, so
You're on.
I did not open up my the first have to find it first. Okay, it's there. It's there. Okay. Yeah. What we're going to be speaking about in our next session is this question which has come up. And this is also a very real question. And you will see, without much effort, you can find synagogues and organizations. Yeah, this is that deal with this question. And by the way, it's related to what we just finished. The issue of what is the separation between what is Jewish and what is not Jewish. Maybe at one time in the past, it was very, very clear, and no one would have some debate, like this debate about the cemeteries. But there are certain practices that also might or might not be ones that are either in that category. This is definitely not Jewish. This definitely is Jewish. Okay. For example, we know that people who call themselves, quote, Messianic Jews. That is not Judaism, right? Those are clearly Christians. By the way, there was a debate this last week about chaplains in the military who are, quote, Messianic Jews who want to wear insignia on their uniform that are worn by Jewish chaplains. And that became an issue again, because we're saying there is a dividing line between what is Jewish and what is not Jewish. And we just talked about an issue in which that dividing line today is a different dividing line than it was in the past, right? In the past, if someone walked out of the Jewish community and married a non-Jew and wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery, the answer would clearly be no. I'm sorry, you left. You go someplace else. Even if your spouse was, supportive or whatever, sorry, you're out. So what about the next question that we're going to deal with? Transcendental meditation and yoga. What about both synagogues who have programs using these techniques of meditation and or yoga? And even as Rini pointed out, there are even synagogues who are having ways in which we say, well, these are just techniques, and we can perhaps change some of what they stand for in a way that means that they are now really part of Jewish practice. Have you ever heard of meditation minions? The Institute for Jewish Spirituality, that's an organization that does meditation minions. So where is the line? Are these practices that are neutral and don't have a tie to something that is clearly non-Jewish? In the traditional texts, the question is, is it avodat chokavim, which is a way of saying, is it idolatry? Are they based in idolatry? Are they idolatry? Or is that, quote, idolatry nature of what they were, not what they are today? So when we look at these questions, and we'll look at two teshuvot on a couple of articles. I just wanted to start by trying to understand a little bit, what are we talking about? Because if I say meditation, and I say transcendental meditation, which is a type of meditation, and there are certainly various types of yoga, and there's just yoga, regular yoga, or is there? Okay. So what I wanted to do first, and we'll look at this again next week, is we'll try to, and I sent out this text to try to understand some definitions. Meditation versus transcendental meditation. And then also, what is yoga? And do these practices inherently contain idolatry or rituals and beliefs that are inherently outside of Judaism, contrary to Judaism? Okay, so that's where you really need to start. And frankly, I learned a little bit myself about this while I was studying this. I should tell you, I have gone to rabbinic retreats in which meditation was part of the program. And there are books about this. But the first thing we're going to try to understand is, is there something called, what is this thing called meditation? But transcendental meditation is actually a very specific type, okay? It's not like the eponyms that we have in normal American life when we talk about any sort of adhesive as Scotch tape, right? That or we talk about any type of copying machine or copying procedure as Xeroxing, right? Those are specific terms that originated in one space. But when we talk about meditation, there is something called meditation, and then there's something called transcendental meditation, which is a specific type of meditation, right? Meditation in and of itself is a general practice. Go down here a bit. General meditation involves focusing attention on an anchor like breath. Be aware of your breath, body sensations, sounds, or observing thoughts without judgment. Cultivating present moment awareness, focus, insight, or relaxation. Okay. It does come from the Buddhist tradition, but is it ultimately, can we separate its origin? We don't want to make the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is that do we fully define something by where it came from? And if we can understand where it came from, that defines it, right? It's like saying Jews don't eat pork because I know that they won't get trichinosis. That may or may not be true, and frankly, I don't care. And I don't even care if it is true, because that genetic fallacy says it came from someplace, but now it has a whole different meaning. So we want to be able to both understand where did it come from, and does it always maintain that connection to where it came from? And we'll say the same thing about meditation, transcendental meditation, and yoga. Let's yet understand where they came from, but let's also try to understand does that origin totally define what they are and how they're used today? Okay? That's where we're going. And we will see that in point of fact, both meditation and yoga, even despite or wherever they quote came from, have been used in Jewish settings in many ways. But we'll take a look at that next time. Any comments or questions before we'll begin this in more detail next time? Comments, questions? Yes, no?
Yeah. Yashikoa, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, we'll take a look at where this goes, where it came from, and how it plays out today, starting next time. See you then. Have a
Thanks.
good day. And let me just take that off, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye.